And the problem with collapse is once you start thinking about it, once you pull on that thread, the entire tapestry of history unravels. That people, when they feel threatened, are more likely to shift in their values towards authoritarianism. Those four darker angels of our nature, including the Dark Triad, I think really explain what happens throughout history. The very worst things to happen throughout human history are actually not collapses, but rather the rise and expansion of empires. But the fact they're trying to keep all this from the public, and the fact that they lobby politicians, I think is an admission that they know if the public knew, they wouldn't stand for it. It's essentially an admission that democracy could save the world.
Hi there. Making sense of the world these days can feel like a lot. And I feel like we're living in this weird Wile E. Coyote moment where we're like, we've gone off the cliff, but like we're not falling down because no one has looked yet. And then again, I also find myself thinking about the media that is coming out, like with all these post-apocalyptic futures. And it's like, we all inherently understand that this world we built is unsustainable and we're just trying to reckon with it. And like, we don't know how to stop this unstoppable runaway train. And the author that I'm speaking to today is someone who studies existential risk, and he believes that collapse is indeed the most likely scenario that we are headed for. But his book, Goliath's Curse, I didn't find it doom and gloom. In fact, I actually found it kind of comforting. In a weird way, it's like he's able to show that all of these problems that we have are all connected to one thing. And the solution isn't to create some sort of despotic dystopia. It's to create a fairer, more equitable world, or as he would put it, to create civilization for the first time. Before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the patrons over on Patreon. You can join the flock if you want. You can see all these names here. That could be you. And you just need to go to patreon.com, link in the description. I also started a newsletter recently, and I'm making that available to every tier, including the free one. And finally, you can also support the Goose for free by just liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, all that good stuff. And finally, I will leave a link for you in the description so you can get your own copy of Goliath's Curse. I would say it's one of the best books I've read in a while, and I would say it makes a great gift for anyone who's worried about the future, which, if you're a thinking person, is everyone. So without further ado, here is my interview with Luke Kemp.
Okay, so humanity is facing several threats at once. We have unconstrained AI proliferation, wealth inequality, global warming, nuclear weapons, pandemics, forever chemicals in the rain, and microplastics in our nards, just to name a few. Now, the book Goliath's Curse shows us how all of these seemingly separate problems are connected by this one thing called the global Goliath. And this book tells a story that is thousands of years old, examining cultures from around the globe and across time, and then looks forward to a future that is not exactly optimistic, where collapse is the most likely outcome. And joining me today to explain how all of these seemingly like intractable and insufferable problems are connected, I'm joined by the author of Goliath's Curse. Please introduce yourself and tell the folks at home why you wrote this book.
Of course, first of all, thank you for the introduction, Aaron. I am Luke Kemp. I am a researcher at the University of Cambridge with the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, also known as CSER, where we study any risk that could cause either global societal collapse or human extinction. I'm also sometimes known with the nickname of Dr. Doom, for obvious reasons. But I like to think there's a bit of hope in there as well, and hopefully you weren't too depressed after reading the book, Aaron.
I take the point of view of hopeful pessimism. Like, I am open to horrible consequences, but I don't let that be, I don't let the possibility of success determine whether or not I move forward and try to address things. And I think that's like a healthy way to look at it. Also, I appreciate. Do you listen to MF Doom as well? I'm a big MF Doom fan. I don't know.
I don't, but I feel like I have to now. Actually, what you just mentioned reminded me of Antonio Gramsci has a great quote of "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will," and that's always charmed me pretty well as someone who studies global catastrophe but has, as people called it, golden retriever energy. So I feel like we're both in the same vibe there.
Let's just sort of back up to you say existential risk, and that's not a discipline that most people are familiar with. Can you just sort of say, I mean, you gave a little brief thing there, but just a little more detail on what studying existential risk entails?
Studying existential risk involves thinking through the worst case scenarios of different threats occurring in the world. So think of, say, for instance, an engineered pandemic being unleashed across the world. I have colleagues who have a background in synthetic biology looking at the likelihood of that prospect and how it would likely play out. I myself come from a background originally mainly in climate change, and hence I've tried to think through what are the kind of worst case scenarios of climate change? What are the big knock-on effects it would cause, whether that's a financial crisis, mass displacement, or even in the worst cases, things like nuclear war. And I have a load of colleagues working on artificial intelligence, thinking through the worst case scenarios of that. But in general, it's a field which is home to lots of different disciplines. It's not an individual discipline per se. Rather, it's a group of scholars united by a focus upon one thing, which is how could we all die?
So to look at that, to study, so this book does like a big anthropological deep dive, which is not exactly something you necessarily expect from somebody who studies climate and that sort of thing. So maybe tell us a bit about how the research that you had to do for this book and why was it so anthropological?
So part of this book was driven by an impulse of, it seems weird to just look at big speculative technologies that could wipe us out in the future, rather than looking back at the 300,000 years of history and data we have of how have societies crumbled, fallen apart, broken down. It seems really weird to ignore all of that. So I wanted to focus upon history in order to have a better understanding of how the future could play out. And of course, everyone when they talk about the future, they have some notion of both human nature and the deep past embedded into that story. Right. I wanted to make sure mine was based upon the best available evidence. And the problem with collapse is once you start thinking about it, once you pull on that thread, the entire tapestry of history unravels. You start to have to ask questions of, why in the first place did we have big civilizations and states and empires? Were they good for most people? Did they even lead to anything like progress? And does collapse in the past have any relevance to the future threats we face today? And the answers I have are roughly organized crime, no, and yes.
Respectively. We're gonna get into, so let's just get definitionally. So what is a Goliath and like why are they cursed?
I use Goliath more or less as for what most people call civilization. The problem of civilization is that the definitions suck. Essentially, They tend to be things like, well, it's a really advanced culture, which that's not very helpful, and it's also not very nice towards indigenous people. Or something like, it's a certain checklist of different factors. It's things like long-distance trade, which technically all hunter-gatherers have, or writing, which we have empires like the Inca stretching all the way from Chile to Argentina who did not have writing. So the checklist doesn't work either. And to me, I always felt pretty weird using the term civilization because it's a term of propaganda that's been used to justify some of the worst atrocities throughout history, such as colonization. Right. It all comes from the Latin root of civilitas, which means, well, has implications of being restrained, politically virtuous, moderate, etc. A civilized person. When one looks with a clear, detailed eye at the rise of these very first civilizations, the first dynasty of Egypt, Uruk in Mesopotamia, or even Cahokia, the first city of North America, what they're united by is not people being particularly civilized. Instead, they're always preceded by warfare. They're marked by human sacrifice and the rise of inequality. And the one thing that is really unifying across all of them is there a change in how we organize ourselves. We start changing from being egalitarian to being a system which is usually called a dominance hierarchy, where essentially a small group of people is ranked above everyone else and takes resources from them while imposing rules on them. I think Goliath is a much more appropriate term for that. In particular because Goliath from the biblical tale is big, it's based upon violence, it comes from the Bronze Age, and it's also pretty fragile. And I really like Goliath in comparison to terms like you probably heard of Moloch, the evil.
Yeah. I did want to, that was actually going to be my next question, is basically within this discourse of what people basically call, either the meta crisis or the poly crisis, or multipolar traps or whatever. It's sort of been trying to encapsulate this tendency for large groups of people to create problems that are extremely difficult to control collectively. So tell us why the Goliath framing is a better way to understand this.
A few different reasons. First of all, it's worthwhile going through some of these terms. We have Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes. The problem with that is it's just referring to the state. And Rome was not just the Roman Empire, it was also the distinction we have between slave and master, rich and poor, men and women, all the different dominance hierarchies that underpin that society. So Leviathan doesn't quite cut it. Also, Hobbes is shit, so I prefer not to invoke him where possible. Yeah. We also have the idea of Moloch, which I think originally comes from Scott Alexander, and then got picked up by Daniel Schmachtenberg and others. Moloch, I never quite liked for a few reasons. I mean, it is kind of cool, invoking a Mesopotamian god who requires sacrifices. It's kind of cool, not going to lie.
Yeah.
The problem is it's way too ethereal. And by talking about this as a god, it makes it seem both inevitable and also to a certain extent unkillable.
Right.
By comparison, Goliath is what these things are. It's a collection of individuals. You can have an individual who's Goliath, but it's also composed of an overarching Goliath structure. And importantly, there are Davids. There are ways to defeat these Goliaths. They're not gods. They're not inevitable. They're not invincible. There are things that can be overcome.
And not only that, they all die. They all seem to die at some point. And like, so why is they all contain their own seeds of their own destruction. So, like, why is that?
Yeah, so the book obviously is called Goliath's Curse for a reason. The idea is that Goliaths contain the seeds of their own demise, and that is because of wealth inequality. Once you get these Goliath systems, they tend to become more unequal over time. This is based upon some work by a colleague of mine at Stanford, Walter Scheidel, in his book, The Great Leveler. And that because of that, they become grossly unequal. So one study of 28 pre-modern states found that they were 77% towards the maximum theoretical level of inequality. That maximum is a situation in which one person takes all the surplus wealth, leaving just enough for people to survive and reproduce. In other words, so Elon Musk's wet dream.
So that's the Gini coefficient, right? That's and we're kind of getting to that point globally, I believe. Not to Google that right now.
Yeah, no, it's similar to, slightly different to Gini. They're both trying to measure inequality, but just in slightly different ways. But the key thing here is that you tend to get rising wealth inequality, and that tends to spill over into other systems. It's pretty rare that rich people just want to keep their money in their bank accounts and don't want to, say, for instance, buy public office or even buy their own private armies, both of which start to happen in empires as they get older. So, for instance, Rome, before it falls into dictatorship, you see the different republican offices increasingly captured by the elite. It's the Senate, for instance, the bureaucracy, even military commanders almost always come from the rich patrician class. And likewise, by the end of Rome, the empire itself, it really struggles to pay its soldiers, but the rich actually have their own private armies. And we see that, of course, happening today as well. Jeff Bezos, it's not enough quite to have billions of dollars in his own private jets. He also needs to have ownership of Audible, Twitch, the Washington Post. Of course, Elon Musk owns Twitter, mainly so he can make sure that everyone always sees what he's tweeting, because that's really important, apparently. But in general, these things leak out. And the key idea is that once you get rising wealth inequality, you get more extractive institutions in which elites take more from the people, that has a whole bunch of knock-on effects that make societies more hollow and fragile.
There was this Lewis Black joke from like 20 years ago of just like, what do you need $100 billion for? Your own fucking space program? And look what happened. They heard the joke and were like, yeah, I guess so.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, exactly. So you make a distinction between like all states eventually collapse, but there's a difference between that and societal collapse. Now, can you just sort of make that distinction before we kind of dive into the root causes of this sort of thing?
Of course. All states do eventually terminate. In some cases, it's as simple as a warlord taking over, some kind of just change of elites. Societal collapse is something much more particular. It's when you have the rapid and enduring contraction and fragmentation of different power networks. When a state falls apart, we call it a state failure or a state collapse. When an economy breaks down, we call it a depression or an economic bust or collapse. When lots of people die really quickly, we call it a population bust or decline or population collapse. When all those different systems go down together, we can call it a societal collapse. And societal collapse does occur repeatedly throughout history. It's, I think, a bit rarer than people tend to think. It has different levels, it's a spectrum of sorts, but it is something that happens again and again, all the way from the very earliest cities and farming communities to the very largest empires.
So to make this all happen, we go back to sort of like the sort of preconditions for making these things happen. The first one, I guess, would be the Egyptians. But before all that, we need Goliath fuel, right? So so take us through what this the these ingredients are that lead to Goliaths becoming far more likely.
So us anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, we've been around for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that time, we were entirely egalitarian. Something seems to change once we enter what's called the Holocene, a period of unnatural climatic stability and warmth. And what changes is we start to get new resources and new technology. It's not just simply that agriculture leads to people adopting big kings. There was this old kind of idea from people like Marx and Smith, for instance, that once you get agriculture, you have enough surplus to start to pay people to order others around. And you kind of need to order others around in order to do cool things like build irrigation, monuments, etc. We now know that's not entirely true. Things like large-scale irrigation and monuments actually occur before you get the first states. And first states don't seem to be just built upon agriculture per se. There's 10 different areas across the world that have agriculture. Only 4 of them developed the first Goliaths. So, for instance, Egypt and Papua New Guinea both have agriculture roughly 7,000 years ago. Papua New Guinea never actually have pharaohs, they never build pyramids. The key difference is not agriculture, but what they're growing. Papua New Guinea grows taro and bananas. Egypt grows wheat. Taro you can store for maybe 6 months. You grow it underground, so it's very much invisible. It can be kept underground even after it's ready to be harvested for a few months. And bananas can be stored for roughly a month. By contrast, wheat advertises itself when it's ready to be harvested. It's very visible, and you can store it for decades on end. The difference between these two things is wheat can be easily seen, stolen, and stored. It's what I call a lootable resource. And similarly, you get hierarchical hunter-gatherers who have slavery and warfare once they get access to things like smoked fish, a lootable resource. Right. That's one form of what I call Goliath fuel. The other two very quickly are monopolizable weapons. Once you have a small group of bastards who have weapons better than everyone else, they can basically create a crime bracket. And hence in China, the Near East, you don't see states and Goliaths pop up until you see the introduction of handheld bronze axes and swords. People would often run away from these structures until they're trapped in what we call caged land. So once you're reliant upon agriculture and you're reliant upon growing crops, it's really hard to move. And additionally, where you see the first Goliaths, it tends to be geography, which is in some way cordoned off. Mesopotamia means the land between 2 rivers in Greek. The first dynasty of Egypt pops up, of course, in Egypt, which is cordoned off between the Red Sea and the Nile. People were trapped. They had less exit options, and hence they kind of had to accept the criminal protection racket.
Right. Now, we all live in an age of lootable resources, monopolizable weapons, and caged land because we all have borders with states that have armies and currency and all that sort of thing. So we can kind of see there's a big progression there. We're going to draw those dots, but I think the last sort of ingredient sort of happens up here. You point to the dark triad. So tell us what the dark triad is and why that sort of makes, when you have all those 4 ingredients, why does that sort of make a Goliath happen?
The dark triad refers to a set of 3 antisocial personality traits. Machiavellianism, the willingness to treat others as means to an end, to manipulate others for political gain. Psychopathy, callousness, and a lack of remorse and empathy. And narcissism, an overinflated sense of ego. And the dark triad is one of what I call the darker angels of our nature. The other is status competition through domination. All of us want to be admired, respected, and loved. Only some of us are willing to get that status through intimidation, bullying, force, violence. It tends to be people who are high in the dark triad. And the thing is, even when you get people in positions of power who aren't high in the dark triad, who are actually pretty competent and good, we have good evidence now that people do actually get corrupted by power. They tend to have less empathy, less compassion. They're more likely to cheat both in games and on their spouses, so they're bad poker buddies and bad friends. And they also tend to have less risk aversion. And on top of all that, we have some evidence now that, actually a lot of evidence now, that people, when they feel threatened, are more likely to shift in their values towards authoritarianism. We see that, of course, in places like Nazi Germany, even the rise of Putin in response to Chechnyan bombings, and of course today in the US. People who are scared are more likely to want strongman leaders. Those four darker angels of our nature, including the Dark Triad, I think really explain what happens throughout history. When you look at history, it's a roll call of mass murderers. Napoleon,
Yeah.
Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, wasn't so great. They're all not particularly nice people, and they're all basically famous for either killing or starving very large numbers of people. And the key thing here is that in order to get power, you usually need to have either force or at the very least to spend most of your life striving for status and power. What you're doing is you're selecting for people who are higher in the Dark Triad and higher in status competition through domination. Which is why even today we see that while at least amongst men, 1% of the general population is probably passes the clinical threshold for psychopathy, in boardrooms and parliaments, it's probably closer to somewhere between 3 to 21%. And even our very institutions, corporations, most states, they look like assholes. They look pretty psychopathic. They lie all the time. They're constantly self-appraising. They're constantly building up their own weapons, looking for advantages. They're not exactly emblematic of the best qualities that we have.
So, just to maybe push back on it, because like the key to this does seem to be dominance hierarchies. And I can't help but think of like Jordan Peterson's sort of famous lobster argument, where he's like, lobsters fight. The strong ones are evolutionarily advantaged. The strong survive, the weak perish. Dominance hierarchies are natural, and no amount of woke propaganda can change that, to summarize it. But you kind of see the emergence of Goliaths as a bit of evolutionary backsliding. Why is that?
Yeah, frankly, I don't want to be like a lobster. I prefer to be human if possible. And in many ways, I see the emergence of Goliath as being a move away from what made us human. Our egalitarianism, our mobility, our interconnectedness. Those are things, as I explore in the book, that actually got us through the Ice Age. They allowed us to essentially survive while all the other hominid species like Denisovans and Floriensis and even Neanderthals all died out. What really changes of dominance hierarchies is we start to resemble the hierarchies of chimpanzees and the harems of gorillas much more. I call it evolutionary backsliding. It's not necessarily a good thing. And even just on a personal note, I think most people don't like the idea of being dominated. And yet for most of history, that's what we've had, domination. And I put forward in the book that this isn't just something which goes against our kind of natural ingrained counter-dominance, egalitarian nature. It's something that isn't very good for us. Once you get the emergence of these dominance hierarchies in agriculture, people get shorter. They actually seem to be less healthy. And for thousands of years, we have a stagnation of human height, people basically staying shorter, and even real income, mainly because most of the benefits of technology. During those thousands of years, we had the iron plow, we had windmills, water mills, etc. Most of the benefits of new technology were taken by a small elite, taken by the successful lobsters, if you will.
Right. So the early ones, the early Goliaths, they kind of started in fits and starts. They collapsed really quickly. Why is that?
In the book, I talk about how egalitarianism wasn't just a necessary condition. It wasn't just simply that our hunter-gatherer ancestors didn't have enough resources that they could actually have a surplus. It's also a choice they seem to make. We have evidence from across a range of different societies where once one individual tries to dominate them, they use what are called counter-dominant strategies. Things like ridicule, ostracism, kicking someone out of a group, or in the very worst cases, in-group executions. And interestingly, in many cases, like Tiwanaku, the very first state of South America, Montalban, the first state of Mesoamerica, Teotihuacan, Geno, a whole bunch of different case studies covered in the book, you see once you get the emergence of inequality and elites, people often either walk away, they kind of vote with their feet, or they intentionally and selectively start destroying elite culture and elite monuments and elite icons. Essentially rebellion. They're voting with fire.
Right.
And in some ways, you can think about these as kind of scaled up counter-dominant strategies. If you can't ostracize the leader, if they've got too much power, instead you just walk away. And rather than having in-group execution, if you have an entire class, you start to just simply burn everything down, or all their stuff down. And in some cases, of course, target them for execution. But in many ways, it was our counter-dominance intuitions kicking back in.
Right. I think there was you start the book with the Mounds of Cahokia, and I had no idea this existed. And can maybe you just tell us what that story can sort of tell us about the emergence of Goliaths in sort of the North American continent?
Yep, of course. Cahokia is a set of over 200 mounds, roughly 500 kilometers southwest of modern-day Chicago on the outskirts of St. Louis. The tallest mound is actually taller than the White House. These were by no means small. And these mounds were actually flat-topped earthen pyramids. People actually built these pyramids by hand, by piling dirt up on each other. It was the very first state of the United States. It held roughly 10,000 to 15,000 people. And interestingly, it pops up after you get the introduction of corn around about 100 years earlier. Essentially what are called the Three Sisters, so squash, beans, and corn, are imported from Mesoamerica, so from the Basin of Mexico, up through the US Southwest into the Mississippi. And everywhere it goes, it tends to leave more hierarchical societies behind. So the first farmers of the US Southwest, the Blowens, they start to build these big sandstone cities of sorts. They also become much more hierarchical. We also have the Hugum, who are very similar. They also have these flat-topped earthen pyramids, and they start to also adopt elites and a priest class to rule over them. Same as Cahokia. Cahokia has a bunch of priests who seem to rule over them, and to justify their rule through human sacrifice. They actually weirdly look kind of similar to the Maya and some of the different kind of Mesoamerican kingdoms. Which
So it's like they imported the idea
exactly
along with the corn.
Precisely. You weren't just importing grain, you were also importing ideas and even architecture. I mean, having flat-topped earthen pyramids with big plazas like Cahokia, that looks pretty similar to some of the cities we have in Mesoamerica as well. Cahokia eventually falls apart, actually pretty quickly. After roughly 100, 200 years, I think within 50 years or so, half the site is abandoned, and we have palisades erected around the center of it, and eventually the entire thing gets abandoned. And what's really most interesting about Cahokia is afterwards, there's no stories about it. It's really remarkable. You have this city of 10,000, 50,000 people, and the native people, the indigenous, the Native Americans don't have any stories about it afterwards. It's like they intentionally left that to rot in the swamps of the Mississippi. And interestingly, the entire area, what's called the vacant quarter, it's pretty much left uninhabited, at least in terms of dense villages or anything, for roughly 100 or 200 years afterwards. It's eventually repopulated, but for a prolonged period of time, the indigenous people avoid that area like it's haunted.
And they also, I think there was like stories, you said there's stories of like, other stories emerge about like countering dominance or whatever, like that sort of seem to emerge in the cultures. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you could just remind me.
Yeah, there's a couple of ones. So, for instance, the Puebloans, who I mentioned before, the first farmers in the Southwest, they have the story of the Great Gambler. The Great Gambler is essentially a god who comes to Earth who is preternaturally good at gambling. Excellent skill to have. They win so many games, they actually start to win all the property as well as the men, women, and children. And in response, they demand, I'll give these back to you if you start to build me these great sandstone houses.
Right.
That's why we get Pueblo Bonito and Shaka Canyon. Eventually, the people band together with a group of other gods, and they overthrow the Great Gambler. And they remember this as pretty much a kind of cautionary tale against hierarchy. The Hugum have a similar one. They have this idea of an evil priest class ruling over them who essentially insult and repeatedly try to kill their culture hero, Elder Brother, until Elder Brother aligns himself with both the people and some other gods, and once again topples the evil regime. Similarly, the Cherokee, who reside over an area which used to have a whole bunch of mound-based societies, they have a story about the Enai Kutani, who were essentially a group of evil magical wizards who became increasingly oppressive until once again there was a grand rebellion that threw them down. And what's really fascinating is you see similar stories in a place called Zomia, which is basically a kind of non-state area in the middle of the Southeast Asia, crossing into China, India, and numerous other areas. Houses about 100 people, surprisingly enough. They also have stories of kings who tried to do a census and eventually they got decapitated and the people fled to the hills. It's a really common occurrence that people who escaped from the earliest Goliaths built up stories to warn against having a Goliath in the future. And it makes you think that maybe if Rome, China, etc. weren't successful, we'd remember them very, very differently. But of course, we're viewing it through the eyes of the victors of history rather than the weary victims.
It's just interesting you brought up Rome, because I was just about to ask, because there's this meme that I don't know, it sort of tapered off, but like it's videos of like women who like film their boyfriends and they just ask them the question, how often do you think about the Empire of Rome? And the answer is always surprisingly high. And it's like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a day or whatever. It's like a crazy amount. And it just seems to be something that our civilization has a lot of roots to it. But like, what are the real lessons that we should be learning about Rome right now? Like, because it's a big topic, I understand, but I think you have a really good take on it.
Yeah, first of all, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that Rome wasn't a great place to be, and we probably have an overly rosy vision of what it was like.
I'm sure it smelled terrible.
Oh, it would have smelled absolutely atrocious, first of all. And it gets worse. If you want to see women rounded up and sold into slavery by gangs of armed men, or you want to see hundreds of people crucified together, you can go, of course, to territories owned by ISIS, previously in Syria, for instance, or Iraq, or you can go back to Rome. We tend to view ISIS, Daesh, very, very differently to how we view Rome, but in some ways they're pretty similar, actually. Rome was also the world's largest slave system. It was even bigger than the transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't a great place for most people. And Rome, I think we can take a few lessons. As mentioned, it's actually a good case study of this idea of diminishing returns and extraction. So it does become more unequal over time. Eventually it falls from being something of a republic, although it was still pretty unequal and still very oligarchical. It falls into full-blown military dictatorship. And you get this intense competition between elites. You also get massive imperial overexpansion. Rome, particularly because the elites were constantly battling for more status and resources, it has to keep on expanding. The problem is, as you expand further afield, you start to have to spend more and more on your military and your supply chains while getting less in return. You basically get diminishing returns. And I have a pretty funny segment of the book where I have this quote from Livy talking about how they were going out to save other people, to protect freedom, justice, and law and order from across the world, and doing it for, of course, altruistic reasons rather than for own good. And then reveal it's actually from Rome, and people probably guess it's from the US. But It's not hard to see how the US resembles Rome in that regard. Similarly, Rome, also because it's trying to compete for so many resources amongst elites, it ends up depleting most of its silver mines in Spain, which means it has to increasingly debase its currency, basically having less and less silver in the coins, which makes them less valuable and means they end up underpaying at the military. In short, Rome ends up being a classic example of how inequality and its knock-on effects hollows out an empire until eventually it's fragile enough that it's knocked asunder by a few different shocks, things like climate change, which Rome did face, disease, as well as invaders. So it's kind of a par exemplar of what this idea of diminishing returns and extraction. And even actually one of the best historians of Rome, Walter Scheidel, has called it exactly that. Both the Han Dynasty and Rome were examples of diminishing returns and extraction. So Rome's a great example of both kind of my thesis of collapse, but it's also an example of why we maybe shouldn't mourn the end of empire.
Right, because there were for the rest of the people who were not the elite class generally, their life was either improved or pretty much stayed the same. Maybe you can tell me about some of the upsides of collapse through the Roman lens.
Yeah, so one of the most bizarre things is after Rome falls apart, skeletons from Rome seem to actually get taller and healthier. And height is a good kind of overall biophysical indicator of your health, how much calories you're getting, how much exercise you're getting, whether you face lots of disease. And they also have less bone lesions, trauma on the bones. They also have less holes in their teeth, dental cavities. All of this suggests they're basically in healthier conditions. And the natural skeptical response is, yeah, but Luke, everyone died. Pretty much everyone died, and there was only a few survivors who had lots of resources. And because of that, of course, they were healthier. That doesn't quite withstand scrutiny. First of all, we're not really that sure of how many people died and how many just migrated. But more importantly, even people outside the empire, during the empire's rule, were taller and healthier. This old trope of the muscle-bound Germanic barbarian is kind of true. Right. And even prior to the rise of Rome, height was growing quite rapidly in the Italian peninsula, and it tails off once Rome starts to rise. to the extent that some archaeologists estimate that people are 8 centimeters shorter than they should have been without the empire.
Huh.
I mean, surprisingly, slavery and having massive systems of inequality aren't healthy people. Crazy,
Yeah,
I know.
apparently. It's not great to have. It's not good for your health. Perhaps we can maybe just talk a little about. You talked about how they had some climate changes, and of course, we're not talking about the global climate change caused by burning of fossil fuels, but the climate does shift. The climate deniers are right. The climate is always changing, but that's a different thing than the climate crisis itself.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be a consistent theme of like climatic shifts and then elite infighting. There's, I guess you call it elite status competition, but AKA elites being too caught up in their own petty bullshit to solve any problems, which does also sound very familiar to today, but now on a global scale. But maybe you could just sort of give how does collapse happen sort of in a general broad stroke so people sort of understand what we're looking at here?
In general, you tend to have increasing inequality. It results in a lot more social friction. As you mentioned, you have a lot of elites who start to do things like coups, rebellions, civil wars in order to gain power. You have a class of people at the bottom who become increasingly poor and immiserated. They have worse health, for instance. And even today in the US, you actually see for one of the first times declining both height and life expectancy. And those people are obviously much easier to convince to try to overthrow the system. And on top of that, you start to often get a whole bunch of knock-on effects like corruption. We have very good evidence that inequality tends to result in high levels of corruption, which means that the state has less and less resources to deal with problems. And having lots of, as you said, elites who are caught up in their own petty bullshit to actually do anything means they're pretty bad at decision-making. They don't want to change the status quo they benefit from, and hence they're incapable of solving a whole bunch of oncoming problems. And this is something which archaeologists, historians, even people like Jared Diamond, of course, have remarked upon, that it's really strange that we had these societies who had all these internal problems, that had really clear disasters up and coming, that didn't seem capable of doing any kind of structural reform. Oligarchy is the reason as to why. The way the collapse plays out from there really depends upon the actual exact society and even who you are. Collapse can be remarkably kind of benign and really quite benevolent. So in the case of the fall of the first imperial regime of Egypt, it doesn't seem to result in much of a change, to be frank. There's no signs of like large-scale civil war. There's a small increase in violence, but there's no such signs of really large-scale famine. But we do see, of course, the pharaohs fall apart, power gets decentralized to the nomarchs, the kind of regional governors. And additionally, people start being able to build their own tombs. You start to see more democratization of religion. People start to build their own tombs, but they also start to get jewelry in their graves as well. They basically get better grave goods. To the extent that some people actually refer to this as the democratization of religion in Egypt. And even the later writers of Egypt kind of admit this. They have this set of poems called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, which is an example of lamentation literature, basically a type of literature where you look back on a past fallen empire and talk about how horrible its fall was. And what's really funny about the Admonitions of Ipuwer is it spends a bit of time talking about, there was civil war, there was this cataclysmic upheaval, there was famine. Once again, very little evidence of that. But it spends even more time talking about how suddenly servant girls could speak back to their masters, and poor people suddenly had access to tombs and houses, and corn was commonly owned by the people. It literally ends with, it has one piece or paragraph ends with the phrase, the nobles lamented and the poor rejoiced, which is pretty telling of what actually happens here.
Sounds good.
Yeah. That being said, there are cases where it's much worse. Like, in the case of the classic Lola Maya, it does seem like a pretty sizable portion of the population is lost. A lot of that would have been migration, but actually in the case of the Maya, at least, quite a lot was death. So how collapse plays out does vary, but I think some of the underlying causes and kind of the rough way it plays out is still the same. Lots of people move, there's a spasm of violence, but a lot of people also benefit. And it usually tends to be the poor rather than the elite.
I want to sort of zoom ahead to the rise of the global Goliath that we have now. And we have the ingredients for what you call like capitalism, what we might call capitalism, in the early Bronze Age Goliaths. Colonization, nothing new, right? Romans did it. So why is it that the global Goliath really starts to emerge out of Europe sort of after the Black Death?
After the Black Death, you actually see some pretty positive effects. Essentially, so many people die that those who are left over have access to many more resources, but they also have more bargaining power. Because labor is scarcer, it means workers can demand more from landlords, bosses, etc., which means real wages actually increase quite dramatically. Eventually, you get a bump in height, so people start to get taller, they get healthier, and we have pretty good evidence they also start to get richer. And you get this fantastic literature from basically rich people complaining about how the poor can now afford cool coats made of wool, etc.
Right.
Horrible, I know. A way of cracking down on that was having enclosure in places like England. So basically closing off areas that were previously held as common property amongst the poor. That creates a bit of a landless class who have to move away from the country into the cities. And those are used more or less to stock up and act as labor in the factories. Interestingly, basically steam power steam power doesn't really have a big advantage over water mills and windmills early on. The big advantage it does have is that basically it can be done in cities rather than particular points on rivers. And additionally, it makes use of all this excess labor quite effectively.
Right.
You basically get a kind of weird marriage between having lots of poor people who are landless and having this new access to a new resource, coal, steam power, etc. That starts to supercharge the way that Goliaths operate. So suddenly you get new weapons. You start to get both innovation in gunpowder. This is also driven by the way Europe is. At the time, Europe is very fragmented after the fall of Rome. You have lots of competing kingdoms, and they have a pretty strong incentive to actually start to experiment with musket powder. And that results in big, quick innovations in cannons, guns, etc., which is one of the reasons that Europe starts to pull ahead of everyone else in terms of military technology. Because it has better military technology, and it starts to have also a bigger populace of people often demanding more goods, colonization starts to become increasingly tempting. And of course, they also have better navigation technologies they can take across the waters and go and colonize places like the Americas. And they do so, and you kind of see a new version of Goliath spawning, one where empires actually span across the oceans. And it's not just agriculture, but it starts to end up being these colonial status goods, things like sugar, cinnamon, spices, wool, cotton. They all become basically status objects, but also a new kind of lootable resource. And of course, it's also all supplied by dreadful amounts of slavery in some of the worst conditions imaginable. But in a way, it's just simply supercharging and combining things that empires were already doing. As you mentioned, capitalism at least goes back to the late Bronze Age. Things like colonization, that was in many ways practiced by the very first farmers of Europe. They colonized the area and supplanted and displaced the original hunter-gatherers. What really happens when it comes to colonization is you start to get a marriage between capitalism being dependent upon colonization and, importantly, the Goliath of Europe having the monopolized weapons to actually do this at scale effectively across the world.
And then the other disease component is that they're exporting new diseases. And maybe you sort of just talk about the role of disease, I think, in colonizing the outside of Europe.
In general, wherever Europeans went, there wasn't just a bloodbath in terms of them using their weapons and oppressing people, but also there was often enormous losses of life due to the introduction of new diseases. We often, at least when it comes to the Americas, refer to this as the Columbian Exchange. Basically, Europe exports a whole bunch of really bad diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and measles, etc., to the New World. In return, they may have gotten some diseases, but they also get a whole bunch of things like potatoes, different crops, tomatoes as well. Funnily enough, many of the cuisines we kind of associate with like Italy or Ireland, they're actually very recent, Irish potatoes, that's only in the last couple of 100 years. Likewise, pizza with tomatoes in the last couple of 100 years. The reason why disease seems to be so bad here is basically because in the old world, you both have much larger cities, which are much more interconnected. We also have bigger draft animals, which means there's more zoonotic infections. But in short, it means we had a much worse time in places like the Near East and Europe when it came to disease. But people who died from disease also left behind survivors who were immune, who often carried things like smallpox. By comparison, people in the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire, the Maya, of course, the Native Americans of North America, didn't have didn't have exposure to things like smallpox. When you encounter disease for the first time, it's pretty bad. And that's what they found. But it's worthwhile reminding ourselves that this wasn't just disease. There were losses of potentially up to 95% of people in the basin of Mexico, for instance. But if they were rebounding, like we saw people rebound from in the Black Death, it should have taken roughly a century or less. It takes them roughly 3 or more. That's because it wasn't just disease, but they're also being kept in horrendous conditions, which obviously encouraged disease, and often had to work in slave-like conditions as well, which would have weakened their immune systems even further. So it was that combination of brutal oppression, warfare, and disease, which led to these enormous losses of life in the colonies.
But hey, some rich people back in Europe got some nice, pretty things.
Totes worth it.
Totes worth it. So, yeah, I know we're kind of running up on time, and there's still a lot to talk about. I do want to sort of zoom ahead forward to, I guess, what people will call the Great Acceleration. So after World War II, people are sort of familiar with this era now. Like after World War II, there's kind of an exponential rise in like everything. We got population, energy use, materials, GDP. All of this is enabled by this new global Goliath that is like creating a bunch of nation states around the world, et cetera. And of course, there's I think you call it the accumulation of existential risk. And, most notably, we're thinking nuclear weapons after the war, but also we're having things like climate change and AI and all that rest that we're dealing with now. So maybe you can sort of give us a picture of like, how do we understand the last 70 odd years through this Goliath lens?
In general, we can view it as the latest manifestation of a much longer term trend of a Goliaths evolving. So after the formation of the very first state, it takes roughly 2,000 years or more for states to go from being roughly a maximum of 1 million square kilometers. And for context, the modern state of Egypt is roughly 1 million square kilometers, to eventually getting substantially larger than that. It's around about 3,500 years later, you start to get empires that go up beyond 5 million square kilometers. So Rome, for instance, and the Han Dynasty in China. Then suddenly, once you get these big colonial empires, as we're discussing, places like the British Empire covers over 42 million square kilometers.
Oh, the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, Sargon, the world's very first emperor, is operating one time zone, while in the case of the British Empire, they're operating across all the time zones. Got to catch them all. The Great Acceleration is essentially... Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, just I'm from Canada and you're from Australia, is that right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we're basically the other sides of the earth.
Exactly, but both products of British colonialism. The Great Acceleration I see as being the next evolution of Goliath. So suddenly you start to see a change in the different forms of Goliath fuel. So we no longer rely upon little resources just in the form of colonial cash crops and agriculture in the form of different grasses. We still do to a certain extent, Things like sugar are still widely used. And of course, over 60% of calories consumed today come from just 4 crops: soy, corn, rice, and wheat. 3 of those were used because they're ideal tax crops 5,000 years ago. But it's also now we use fossil fuels. And in many ways, what happens in the Great Acceleration is a fossil fuel infrastructure, industrialization starts to spread across the world. It starts to become much more intensive as well. On top of that, we have new monopolized weapons. Of course, in 1945, the US used the first atomic bomb, and suddenly atomic bombs become the ultimate monopolized weapon, a resource, a weapon that can do great devastation, but also can be controlled by a single individual. In the case of the US, the president has authority to essentially launch all the nuclear weapons without any real oversight or accountability. We often rely upon the nice comforting story of, if he did that, someone in the military would say, no, don't do that. Maybe, but we have to bear in mind the entire military is built on getting people to obey orders. Last but not least, we also start to see the rise of new forms of caged land. You start to get things like identity cards, much stronger states with mass surveillance measures, etc. So Goliath is evolving, and also it's starting to get exported across the entire world. It's the construction of what I call the global Goliath. It's easy to think of the modern world as being sets of different competing Goliaths and empires: China, Russia, the US. But what's remarkable is they all look pretty similar. They're all nation states, topped by one executive who goes to the United Nations. They all have militaries which actually look pretty similar, with divisions between Army, Navy, and Air Force. They all have nuclear weapons. And they all are part of one global integrated economic system, global capitalism. Every country is capitalist, even China. And they all have very similar rules, actually. There's a reason why you can easily send money to Saudi Arabia or to China or the US. That's because all of them have very similar property rights based upon either New York state common law or British common law. In short, we're enmeshed into one single global Goliath that was more or less started to get constructed during colonialism and then got really enmeshed under US leadership during the Great Acceleration. And what I try to really get across in the book is while people are often distracted by collapse, the very worst things to happen throughout human history are actually not collapses, but rather the rise and expansion of empires, like colonization.
So maybe that's a great way to, locate myself. I'm in Canada, and Trump has been making jokes, we'll call it, about annexing us, along with like Greenland and the Panama Canal, these sorts of things. We've also related the U.S. to the Roman era. What's sort of your take on just like the US Goliath, and what should folks in Canada be mindful of? What should we be doing? What's your advice?
First of all, the US. I think what's happening in the US is just most states in the world becoming more unequal and drifting back towards the historical norm of having much more unequal, predatory, autocratic states. During the 1950s, the world wars basically wiped out a huge amount of old money. You started to see the rise of democratic welfare states, and all of that basically led to what's called the Great Compression. Wealth inequality drops dramatically across the OECD, across the world in general. Wealth inequality starts to creep up in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the top 1% held about 25% of global wealth. Today, it's more like 40%. And with a pretty reliable time lag of a decade or two, you start to see democratic backsliding, rising polarization, and falling trust in public institutions. And of course, the rise of the far right. And what's happening in the US is unfortunately just a trajectory that most other countries are on. Just the US is in pole position because they always like to be coming first. But UK, we look pretty similar. We also have a rising far right who are basically scapegoating immigrants. We have a cost of living crisis. We have rising inequality and a lack of trust in our institutions, rising polarization. The same with Germany with the Alternative for Deutschland. So I hope the lessons that Canada takes is let's not do that. Let's not be like that.
Right.
That would be the first primary lesson. Yeah, and you guys, I think, partially did that with the last election. I think that was, in some ways, more or less a pushback against Trump of maybe we shouldn't vote for the far-right populist.
Yeah, I would call it reactionary centrism.
Reactionary centrism, but I think we have to go further than that. We have to have reactionary democratization. If you really don't like Trump and you really don't like what's happening in the US, what's happening there is rising wealth inequality and backsliding democracy. Let's innovate with democracy and have much better democracies in places like Canada and the US. Canada and Australia. Let's try to actually battle against wealth inequality.
Yeah, there's a couple other questions. I do want to get into the solutions here, but there's a couple of other questions that I feel like I need to ask. First of all,
let's go.
Climate change. You have a lot of things to say on that, and there's this narrative that we're all to blame for climate change because we all use fossil fuels. But you point to these people called the agents of doom. These are not MF Doom fans as much as we want to be. But yes, could you tell us about the agents of doom and why we shouldn't feel so bad about driving to work?
When you look at catastrophic risk today, it's remarkable that it's produced by a very small number of institutions. Nuclear weapons, 85% of stockpiles held by two countries, Russia and the US. It's maintained and upgraded by roughly 24 companies, including the very big arms manufacturers like Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, etc. If you look at climate change, roughly 80% of historical cumulative emissions come from just 10 countries if you count the European Union as one country. 25% comes from just one, the United States. If you really want AI, then you really have to worry about three big companies, Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, all of which are headquartered in the US. Even when it comes to climate change from the private sector lens, it's pretty clear that's only a small number of companies. I think it's, 57 companies are responsible for 77% of emissions since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And when you take a class lens, exactly the same thing. The top 1% globally of wealth holders have more emissions than the bottom 66% of humanity. There was one study also which suggested that if we're looking across a set of planetary boundaries, so climate change as well as things like biodiversity loss, then the top 10% of income earners across the world are responsible for somewhere between 33 to 67% of planetary degradation. This is not a story of everyone destroying the earth. It's a story of the rich and a small number of empires and key institutions which profit handsomely from destroying the earth and producing great risk. And importantly, most people don't want this to happen. If we actually were basing policy on majority opinion, we would have abolished nuclear weapons across places like Israel, the US, and even China. We'd have much stronger climate action, including in Canada and Australia. And we'd have placed a moratorium on killer robots. Survey data suggests that's what most people want. We don't do those things. Why? Well, in large part because of the producers. The fossil fuel industry knew about climate change back in the 1970s. Exxon knew about it. They buried the information and intentionally ran misinformation, disinformation campaigns to misinform the public and cast doubt on the science of climate change. And there's actually just a book that came out, I think last week, called Climate Obstructionism, which gives you a really detailed historical account of all the different ways in which the fossil fuel industry across places like Canada and Australia have distorted attempts to try to regulate fossil fuel emissions. They wouldn't do that if they wouldn't have basically buried the information all around these campaigns if they felt that, don't worry, everyone's responsible and they're going to be quite happy to keep on emitting.
Right.
Why the fuck bother with all this? Like, why spend tens of millions of dollars? And notably, some of the money that was spent, some of those tens of millions of dollars, it went to a campaign back in 2004, I believe, with a PR firm called, I think it was Ogilvy and Mayer, who basically told ExxonMobil at the time, let's do a campaign where we make carbon footprint calculators so people know how guilty they should
BP,
feel.
right? Or was it BP?
It could have been BP, actually. I have to double check.
It was BP.
I was Beyond Petroleum, correct. And they basically created carbon footprint calculators, and they started basically creating a campaign of, we all need to do a little bit of voluntary can-do action. And they started more or less intentionally trying to place the blame upon individual consumers, while they themselves were, I think, making, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was definitely billions of dollars in revenue from selling fossil fuels. They did that because, once again, they wanted to place scrutiny and democratic accountability away from their own operations.
Right.
Plastic industry did the same thing.
I was going to say, like dumping 3 million barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico.
Precisely. And the same thing happens in the plastic industry when it comes to forever chemical pollutants with Freeman and DuPont. They also know about the dangers of it. They intentionally bury it. But the fact they're trying to keep all this from the public and the fact that they lobby politicians, I think, is an admission that they know if the public knew, they wouldn't stand for it. It's essentially an admission that democracy could save the world.
All right, so that's a perfect way to get into, it seems to be like there's the possible futures of like apocalypse dystopia or the secret third thing where we slay the Goliath. But before we kind of get into that, why do you think collapse is the most likely outcome? It just seems like feels like it's a real gut punch when I read that. I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to gut punch you, but just try to stay truthful.
Yeah. Hopeful pessimism.
Exactly. In the book, I talk about how we can't put a date on doomsday. We can't make a precise, quantifiable prediction about when the world will end. That's something which we can't do because even the world's very best super forecasters can't have much accuracy beyond a year. So if anyone tells you that they know exactly when doomsday will occur, even if it's an Oxford or a Cambridge academic, they're usually full of shit. What we can do is we can understand what are the big dynamics across history and where they're pushing us towards. And in the book, I make a pretty simple argument of if we have arms races over the space of decades and centuries with improving technology, where will that end? It's very difficult to imagine deterrence working out perpetually. In just a few decades of having nuclear weapons, we've had a dozen nuclear near misses. And this includes situations where it's this sheer dumb luck that we did not have a thermonuclear war. I wouldn't bet upon that holding out for the space of centuries or decades, particularly with new weapons being developed and, of course, upgraded nuclear missiles for things like supersonic weapons. And we can think of the same thing when it comes to resource races. Countries compete for resources, then they often compete to have lower regulations and a race to the bottom. Companies do the same thing. Over time, where is that likely to end? You can't rely upon us always finding a plucky techno fix at the last minute to save us from things like climate change, ocean acidification, or forever chemicals. Again, it's a really weird race and gamble, which we're not going to win. I call these things races for resources, races for status, and races for arms Goliath traps. Some people call them multipolar traps or something like that. I call them Goliath traps because ultimately, this is not something that everyone does.
Right.
When it comes to these kind of traps, which happen in game theory, ordinary people don't actually do them when you put them into laboratory settings. For instance, you probably heard the Triad of the Commons, this idea if you have an open access common resource, everyone will have an incentive to use it, will lead to over-resource use. That basically doesn't happen as soon as you let people communicate in a laboratory setting. Suddenly, the Triad of the Commons no longer occurs. Similarly, for games like the Prisoner's Dilemma, it doesn't actually happen. You get this Nash equilibrium where people are all trying to defect. Instead, people actually cooperate surprisingly frequently. In general, across game theory, we find that people are pretty concerned about their reputation, and they're really concerned about things like fairness. And we're not very rational, actually. We tend to do irrational things all the time. Interestingly, there are two groups of people who often fall into these game theoretic traps, things like arms races. People who defect regularly tend to be people who either A, higher in the dark triad, or B, have been trained in economics or finance, which makes sense if you think everyone's an arsehole. You have full license to be an arsehole yourself, and that kind of kicks off a bad dynamic. Mm-hmm. But it's also indisputable that it does seem that most companies in most states do behave like these actors. They do fall into these traps. They do arms races, etc. That's why I call them Goliath traps. It's things that happens to Goliaths and people in the dark triad. It doesn't happen to most people. And what that means is, I think in the long term, these Goliath traps will lead to self-termination. They'll lead to the entire system falling apart. They'll lead to global societal collapse, unless we find a way to escape from Goliath.
And how do we do that? How do we do it?
Yeah, in the book, I try to put forward a rough blueprint for how to escape from Goliath. This includes very precise measures for how we can decrease existential risk. So, for instance, if you're really worried about climate change or any kind of environmental risk, then just do the really basic thing of starting to price environmental and social damages that companies produce into the price. Like right now, we're being lied to every time we buy a good. It's not actually factoring in things like the 12 million people who die every year due to air pollution. All it's doing is making the economy more honest. And I have a big suite of these things, including things like abolishing nuclear weapons, having an initial step of reducing nuclear weapons to stockpiles of roughly 200 or 300, which is kind of minimum that most papers agree on would act as a deterrence. So if you're really just using nuclear weapons to defend yourself, just have 200, 300, and then eventually get to zero. The problem is we're probably not going to do those things until we get out of Goliaths. And the way to do that is to basically level all the different power structures we have. I think the best measure we can do is democratization. In the book, I have this thought experiment, which I call the Trinity Jury. So many people will be familiar with the idea of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the quest by the US to build the world's first atomic bomb. They did so and detonated it in the sands of New Mexico in 1945. Beforehand, the scientists were taking bets as to whether this would destroy the entire world because the physicist Edward Teller had made a calculation that there was a non-zero chance that igniting the bomb would also ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth, killing every single life form. By that time, the US also knew that the Nazis no longer were pursuing their own bomb. They weren't even capable of doing so. So this wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. Of course, they still went ahead and did the test. They still detonated the weapon. The question I have in the book is, imagine if you had a citizens' jury. So you randomly selected people from across the US population, cleaners, plumbers, nurses, farmers, and you had them briefed by experts. They got told, by the way, guys, there's a non-zero chance this kills literally everyone, including all your friends and family and all future generations. And we don't need to build this because the Nazis no longer can build their own bomb. Also, we think the war's probably going to end in a few months. Do you reckon we should detonate it?
Most people would say no.
Yeah, exactly. Like the response we got from everyone either varies from laughter through to just like, of course not. Because of course not. But the same goes for things like ExxonMobil. If Exxon back in the 1970s goes to bury information, but they had a citizens jury next to the board, I doubt the citizens jury says, yes, please go ahead. Please bury the information and spend millions of dollars deceiving all of my family and friends that climate change is not real and not a big issue. In general, democracy makes pretty good decisions. These citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries make pretty good decisions, and they're pretty risk averse. So that's one of the key ways I think we can actually escape from Goliath is just having more democracy, not just in our governments, but also our workplaces. You can't really call yourself a democracy if you have the ability to vote every 4 years, but you work 9 to 5 in an autocracy. And I have a whole bunch of other ones. I also talk about how we could have democracy, but if we have billionaires, they will always find a way to rig the system. So let's just put a cap of $10 million in place. Anything beyond that, let's face it, is status competition. You know, if they really want it, we can give them a nice little trophy saying, congratulations, you won capitalism. Here, have a cookie. You should be proud of yourself.
Yeah.
There's no reason they should have more money to upend and undermine our democracies.
Here in Canada, there's David Suzuki was just like, we should just give billionaires the big dick prize, and it's just a statue of a dick. And he goes, congratulations, you have the biggest dick. Now, please fuck off. It's kind of how he says it. But we're sort of running to the end here, pushing up against time. What would you say is like the main takeaway for people after you want people to have after reading your book?
I think the main take I want them to have is that things do look grim, that inequality and the structures of domination we live in are likely to lead into some pretty dark places, whether that's, as you mentioned, the dystopia of what I call Silicon Goliath, a world of autocracies with mass surveillance, or eventual global societal collapse. But that these are things that don't need to happen, that we're completely capable of doing democracy at scale. We're completely capable of having a world that's built upon mutual aid, reciprocity, egalitarianism, rather than competition and domination. And that we're quite lucky to live in a world where building a safer one also means building a more just one. And in many ways, it's just returning to what made us human in the first place, returning back to what I would call civilization. Civilizations are societies that are built upon non-violent, voluntary cooperation. We should be using our technology to do that. And that's the best way to not just build a better world, but also to avoid societal collapse.
Luke Kemp, thank you for joining me.
Aaron, thank you for having me.